Making custom scales for a knife handle is easier than you might think. The project we'll be working on today will not only make a great gift, but will also expand your woodworking skills. You'll get comfortable with some materials and methods you might not regularly use. The main ingredients for this project are a Hock Tools 5-inch chef knife blank, a Lizard Blanks knife block mold, and Moss Deep Pour X Epoxy, Eye Candy Ocean Blue Pigment, Mixol ME1 Gold Effect Concentrate, 2 Moss 32-ounce mixing cups, and an Allway Helix 1-gallon mixer. After you've gathered your materials, the first step is to mix the epoxy. We use Deep Pour X, which is a 2-to-1 resin to hardener mix. Deep Pour X allows you to pour up to 3 inches in thickness in a single pour. Determine how much epoxy you will need. Then use the ratio marks as a guide to carefully pour in the resin, followed by the hardener. There is a handy resin calculator available on the Moss website. Mix for about 5 minutes. If using a power mixer, try to use low speed. Keep the mixing head below the surface as much as possible to avoid whipping air into the mixture. Next, pour the mixture into the second cup. Add any colorants, and mix for another 5 minutes. As you can see from that explosion, it's important to keep your Mixol nozzles clean. We decided to roll with the blooper, however, and ended up with a pretty interesting dark, swirly emerald color that catches the light nicely when it moves around. Use a tongue depressor or similar apparatus to scrape any extra epoxy mix off the sides of the cup and stir by hand. Let the mixture sit for 30 to 45 minutes to allow any air bubbles to release. Now it's time to pour. Position the wood as you'd like it, and then slowly pour the epoxy into the mold. Be careful not to introduce too much air into the mix. The wood inclusion wanted to float and move. We needed to use a small block to clamp it in place while it cured. The sides will be trimmed away so the block's placement against the wood won't interfere with the final results. We let the epoxy cure over the weekend. After curing, we took the block out of the mold. First, we removed the end cap. This releases the vacuum pressure created inside the mold by the curing epoxy, as it forces the air out of the mold. Next, replace the end cap, making sure not to fully tighten the wing nuts. Loosening the block is as easy as banging the mold upside down on a hard surface, though a little persuasion with a mallet isn't inappropriate. Next, we squared up one corner of the block at the table saw. Decide how you want to orient the scales. Cut them from the same side of the block so that they are book matched when you lay them side by side. Each scale should be at least 1/4 of an inch thick to start. Now it's time to prepare the knife blank. It's very sharp, so be careful when removing it from the packaging. To protect your hands while adding the scales, wrap the blade portion in masking tape and add an extra piece on the sharp edge. This will help protect both you and the blade. Determine which sides of the scale should face out and which should face in. Lap the inward-facing sides of the scales with 120 grit sandpaper to make sure they're flat. Mark the inside face as inside to prevent later confusion. Orient the scales as they will be positioned when the knife blank is between them. Then position the knife blank as desired on the top of the stacked scales. Carefully tape the stack together with the knife blank on top rather than between the scales. Use the holes in the knife blank as a guide to drill 1/4-inch holes through the scales. Place the pins through each hole as they are drilled to keep everything aligned. After drilling, and with the pins inserted to keep everything aligned, remove the tape and place the knife blank handle in place over the pins. Then trace the knife blank handle onto the scales. After the outline has been traced, while continuing to keep the pins inserted, use a bandsaw, coping saw, or scroll saw to saw the blank to rough shape. With the pins still inserted, use a spindle sander, belt sander, rasps, files, or other method to complete the initial shaping of your blank. Shaping started on an oscillating spindle sander. Then we went through the grit progression using 4-inch scuff balls in extra coarse, coarse, and medium, and followed with 2.5-inch balls in fine and ultra fine. Now prepare the knife blank for attachment of the scales. Coat the rough-shaped scales in a light coat of wax to allow easy removal of epoxy squeeze out. Scuff the pins and tang portion of the knife blank with 120 grit sandpaper to improve epoxy adhesion. After these are sufficiently scuffed, apply epoxy and attach the scales. Apply epoxy to one side of the blank handle and to the inside face of the corresponding scale. Apply epoxy to the pins and push through the scale into the blank's tang until they are just barely protruding through the tang. Apply epoxy to the other side of the blank's handle and to the inside faces of the corresponding scale, and push the pins the rest of the way through into that scale. Clamp the assembly and allow the epoxy to cure. After curing, remove the clamps and sand or rasp the project to bring your scales to final shape. For more controlled shaping, you may want to use a rasp. You'll notice that we used the scuff balls with a drill chuck inserted in a lathe this time. We didn't have a buffer on hand, and this alternative method gave us a bit more control of the shaping. Next, I put a cyanoacrylate or CA finish on the knife handle. This is often a finish used by wood turners with thin viscosity CA glue, but when spreading over a flat surface, we found it helpful to use a thicker viscosity to give more time to spread the adhesive. More than one coat can be applied until you end up with an even surface. After our CA was cured, we buffed it out using a buffing compound on the lathe. We hope you find this project to be a great learning experience and that your custom-made knife serves you for many years to come.